On this vote, the yeas are 223. Oh. Members now voted. Yeah, it did.
Somebody else one more, yeah. And then
Mr. Owens.
he votes no.
Mr. Owens votes no.
I got to
On this vote, the yeas are 223, the nays are 194. The queries question is ordered. The question is on the adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. For what purpose, the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
And that is her recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members record their vote by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
It's a vote on the rule for consideration of 2 energy bills, including one that would boost oil and gas production on federal lands. It's a 5-minute vote. Well, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell addressed the Republican conference earlier today. CQ reporting that he told members to hold the line at sequestration spending levels during budget negotiations and reassured them he doesn't support the immigration bill the Senate passed earlier this year. Following that meeting, Republican leaders spoke to reporters, and we'll show you as much as we can from their news conference as this vote continues.
Morning, everyone. You know, it's not just Americans who are getting their cancellation notices that are upset. It's everything that follows. What we're seeing here is a pattern of broken promises from the administration. You know, the one is, well, if you like your health care plan, you can keep it. And I think most Americans are finding out that's really not true. And then secondly, what the President said is that, you know, we pass Obamacare, premiums are going to go down. And I think what many people are seeing is the premiums are going right through the roof. Listen, it's just one more reason why this health care law needs to be scrapped now.
Good morning. You know, the American people are very, very worried. You know, moms and dads are worried that they're going to lose their health care plan, and that they have the one that they have and they like, and they're worried whether they're going to be able to actually go to the same pediatrician that they want their children to go to. You know, young adults are now witnessing the increase in health care costs and are wondering whether they're going to be able to afford even a basic policy. Individuals who are going on to the healthcare.gov website are beginning to fear that perhaps their identity will be stolen. You know, millions of Americans we know now are receiving cancellation notices from the insurance company. The President broke a major promise to the American people, and now it is hard for them to trust any assurances under this law. We've heard the President say that he didn't know about the problems with the website, but yet a report has just come out to say that there were warning signs throughout the White House from a report back in March that there was going to be a problem with the rollout of this health care law. Now, Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats were some of the architects of Obamacare. They helped design this law. Last week, 39 of them joined us in trying to help Americans that are being hurt under this law. It is time for the Senate to join them and join us and act to help protect the American people.
We all know the famous quote by then Speaker Nancy Pelosi that you have to pass the bill to know what's in it. American people, 55%, disapprove of this law, mainly because of the three main principal waves of the law itself. First, it was the website. Didn't work. Consumer Report. Have you ever noticed Consumer Report to recommend you not to go to a website? They recommend Americans not to go to the website because of fear of having fraud. The failure of the President to say that if you have your health care and you like it, you can keep it. Americans know now that that was not true and it wasn't being honest. The final wave of the principle of failure is going to be the cost. The idea that this was going to lower costs, they say it's going to raise the cost. You won't be able to keep your doctor. It is time now for the Senate to act with us as the American people continue to see that this is a major failure and will not solve the problem.
This week I got a letter from Maureen Hunter. She lives in Spokane Valley, and this is what she wrote to me. Kathy, like so many others, I've had my health insurance policy canceled. My policy was affordable and filled my needs as a 63-year-old woman. I feel so helpless, and my heart is heavy. I've worked since I was 13, and I've done what I could to be productive and responsible. Do you see a way out of this awful situation for me and millions like me? How did people like me end up being on the casualty list? Please help. And her words struck me because she's not different than millions of hardworking average Americans all across this country. We've heard the numbers. Over 5 million have received a letter canceling their health insurance policy, and yet just over 100,000 have signed up for the plan. But these are more than just numbers. These are real people that are being impacted, like Maureen, who come January 1st doesn't know whether or not she's going to be able to go see her doctor. Now, the House has passed a legislative solution. The President has proposed this political fix, short-term. In states like mine, Washington State, the governor and the insurance commissioner have said they're not going to implement the President's quick fix. And so it leaves people like Maureen wondering what's going to happen on January 1st. We need real solutions. We need to help people all across this country. We need to make sure that we have health care that is affordable and accessible to the people of this country.
The letters continue to pour in our office, sad letters about people that are losing their health insurance. Some of the saddest letters that I've read are from young people that are just starting out in life. They're trying to pay their bills, pay their student loans, find employment without having their hours cut in such a tough job market with unemployment at record highs for these young folks. And the letters are telling the story. Their premiums are increasing, some in Kansas close to 130%. They're out-of-pocket costs.
22, the nays are 196. The resolution is adopted without objection. Motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the question on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal, on which the Chair will put de novo. The question is on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the Journal. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The stands approved. Gentleman from Washington, rise.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 1965.
Action. To House Resolution 419 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 1965. The Chair appoints the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Fox, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
Ready? The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 1965, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to streamline and ensure onshore energy permitting, provide for onshore leasing certainty, and give certainty to oil shale development for American energy security, economic development, and job creation, and for other purposes.
The House will be in order. Members will please take their conversations off the floor. Sorry. The committee will be in order. Members will please take their conversations off the floor. The committee will be in order. Members will please take their conversations off the floor. Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, each will control 30 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, with millions of Americans still looking for work, growing debts and deficits, and energy prices that are still far too high, the United States needs to implement an all-of-the-above energy plan to responsibly harness our nation's energy resources on our federal lands. New energy production is one of the best ways to grow the economy and create new jobs to put people back to work. One needs to look no further for proof of that than go to the states like North Dakota that have flourishing economies and some of the lowest unemployment rates in the country, and it's all due to energy production. Because of this energy boom, the U.S. is now projected to be the world leader in oil production by 2015, surpassing Saudi Arabia. The catch is that this increased oil production is happening on private and state lands, which is good, Madam Chairman, places that aren't as restricted by onerous federal regulations and policies. However, federal lands are being left behind. However, this lack of production on federal lands is not for a lack of resources. We have tremendous potential for new onshore oil and natural gas production on federal lands. But unfortunately, the Obama administration is actively and purposely keeping these resources off limits. Leasing and permitting delays, regulatory hurdles, and ever-changing rules are a few of the reasons energy production on federal lands is in decline. President Obama has had the 4 lowest years of federal acres leased for energy production going back to 1988. Under his administration, the average time, Madam Chairman, to get a drilling permit on federal lands is 307 days. By contrast, it takes an average of only 10 days in North Dakota to get a permit, and another example, in Colorado, it only takes 27 days. So it's no wonder that state lands are flourishing while federal lands are experiencing a decrease in energy production. That's unacceptable, and this bill today offers real solutions to unlock the shackles that have been placed on our federal lands. H.R. 1965, the Federal Lands Job and Energy Security Act, is a package of bills that would help us expand oil, natural gas, and renewable energy production on public lands. It will streamline government red tape, break down bureaucratic hurdles, and put in place a clear plan for developing our own energy resources. Even more importantly, these bills will spur job creation and help grow and strengthen our economy. Now, Madam Chairman, I want to take a moment to specifically highlight the importance of the third title in this bill, the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska Access Act. NPRA was specifically designated in 1923 as a petroleum reserve. Let me repeat that, Madam Chairman. NPRA was specifically designated in 1923, that's 90 years ago, as a petroleum reserve. Its express purpose was to supply our country with American energy. That was the foresight of Congress 90 years ago. That's why it's completely unacceptable that the Obama administration this year finalized a plan to close half of NPRA to energy production. Now let me repeat. We set aside NPRA 90 years ago for energy production, and this administration unilaterally shut off half of it. So this bill would nullify that plan and require the Interior Department to produce a new plan for responsibly developing these resources. This bill would require annual lease sales in the NPRA and ensure that necessary roads, bridges, and pipelines needed to support energy resources out of the NPRA can be approved and completed in a timely, efficient manner. Now, Madam Chairman, this is crucial to the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline System, or TAPS. And it's crucial because that pipeline needs to remain full and operational. Much focus has been given to the Keystone XL pipeline, and properly so. But we cannot forget that TAPS is one of the most important pieces of energy infrastructure in our nation. Reduced production in Alaska has left TAPS at less than half of its capacity, threatening a shutdown that would cost jobs and significantly weaken our energy security. We cannot allow that to happen, and developing our resources in the NPRA is vital to ensuring that it doesn't. I urge my colleagues to support this job-creating legislation and allow our federal lands to be part of our nation's energy equation. We've seen the jobs that can be created through energy production. We've seen how it can grow local communities and create thriving economies. We've seen how lower energy prices are vital to putting more money in the pockets of American families. We know what's possible. It's just a matter of realizing the potential by allowing new energy production to occur on our federal lands. The majority of the provisions in this bill passed the House last Congress with bipartisan support. It's time for Congress, in this Congress, to once again move forward with this common sense, job-creating energy plan. And with that, Madam Chairman, I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to this misguided, unnecessary, and environmentally harmful piece of legislation. We all know that under President Obama, the United States is in the middle of an almost unprecedented oil and gas boom. Last week, the Energy Information Administration said that for the first time in 20 years, U.S. crude oil production surpassed imports. Also last week, the International Energy Agency projected that the U.S. would become the #1 oil producer by 2015. The headlines keep coming. On October 4th, EIA reported, quote, the U.S. expected to become the largest producer of petroleum and natural gas hydrocarbons in 2013, end quote. On October 16th, the headline read, quote, the U.S. is already world's #1 producer, consultants say, end quote. Even the Republicans have to admit this energy boom is happening. But they say it has nothing to do with President Obama because they don't want to give him credit for anything. They say all of the increased production, all of it is coming from state and private lands. President Obama, they believe, is choking off production on federal lands. And that's why we need the giveaways to big oil. That's why we need these attempts in this legislation to stifle public comment. That's why we need drill-at-all-cost measures. But they're wrong, flat out wrong. What has actually happened to oil production from our public and Indian lands out west since President Obama took office, you may ask? It has skyrocketed. Onshore oil production from federal and Indian lands, just what we're talking about in this legislation, has gone up every year since the President has been in office. It's now 35% higher than it was under President Bush. Yet this legislation would not just reduce environmental protections, it would gut them, it would remove them. So here's an even more interesting statistic. The nationwide increase in oil production since President Obama took office, increase in oil production, is 30%. The increase on federal and Indian lands is even outpacing the increase nationwide, including private lands. I believe it's simple enough that anyone should be able to understand this. Oil production for the entire country is up 30%. Oil production on federal and Indian lands is up 35%. But the Republicans have this playbook that they just can't get away from, this shop-worn 2008 drill, baby, drill playbook. And so they want to try to make things easier for big oil, while trying to ensure that conservation and hunting and fishing and recreation and renewables and everything else that these federal lands might be used for have to take a back seat to drilling. The entire premise of this bill is that President Obama is shutting off access to federal lands and driving oil production down. The premise is false. We're not here because we need this legislation to increase our domestic production of oil and gas. And it certainly has nothing to do with prices at the pump. We are not here because the bill will have any impact on the world price of oil or gasoline at the pump. We're not here because anyone thinks this bill has a chance of becoming law either. We're here because we have a deeply divided Republican caucus. And one of the few things that unites this caucus is the belief that big oil should enjoy higher profits, and those profits should come from publicly owned land. We're here because bills to convert our priceless natural treasures into profits on big oil's balance sheets are about the only idea that our Republican colleagues can agree on among themselves. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to a member of the committee and a former chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young. 3 minutes.
The gentleman from Alaska is recognized for 3 minutes.
Madam Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to revive and extend.
Objection.
You know, it's amazing as I sit on this floor after 40 years and listen to so much nonsense from the other side when it comes to energy. This increase of production in the United States came from private land and state lands, not the federal lands, and those are the facts. And we are still not independent from those oils from the Mideast that caused this disruption in our economy. And it has the same litany of words over and over again. We have to save, we can't produce, but we have to have employment, we'll have a stimulus package, and in fact, we'll have more government borrowing for the economy and forget real jobs. But I want to talk about Title V in this legislation. The Federal Lands, Job and Energy Security Act contains a number of measures to promote energy development by and for the benefit of Indians and Alaska Natives. Specifically, Title V contains a range of measures requested by a number of Indian tribes, the Alaska Native corporations, to streamline burdensome federal regulation and legal procedures that hinder exploration, development, and production of energy on their lands. There are 56 million acres of land held in trust by the federal government for the benefit of Indians, 56 million. In Alaska, there's 44 million acres, a total land mass larger than the state of California. Many of these areas are rich in untapped energy resources. It is estimated that up to 10% or more of our nation's energy is obtained on native lands. The problem is that outdated federal policy thwarts the ability of tribes to use their lands for their benefit. Leases of lands, Indians' trust land, require federal review and approval, which arguably brings little or no value to the tribes involved. If federal review and approval of energy leases created by economic value, then private landowners and state governments would be clamoring to have their projects reviewed and approved by the federal government too. These are a few better measures on how ineffective federal supervision of Indian affairs has been that the fact that since 2010 nearly $5 billion has been paid by the government to Indians to settle federal mismanagement of their trust lands. While many Indian tribes and Alaska Native corporations have made great strides in building businesses and strengthening their economies, tribal communities remain at the bottom of nearly every economic and social indicator. The sad fact that the 21st century America, severe poverty wears a Native face. And instead of helping tribes make positive strides for energy development, the Obama administration is erecting new hurdles. The EPA canceled a valid permit for the largest tribe to operate a large power plant on its land with its coal. The Department of Interior has proposed a hydraulic fracturing rule that makes Indian lands less competitive and less attractive to the industry, again taken away from the American Indians. Fortunately, several tribes are seeking to shed the current federal system altogether and take over management of their lands and energy resources. And these tribes ask for provisions in Title V of the bill today. It is a great pleasure that the standalone bill on which Title V is based, H.R. 1548, has been endorsed by the National Congress of American Indians and several individual tribes. It is time to stop treating Indian trust lands as public lands. They are not public lands, they're private lands. And increase the tribes' powers of self-governance over the energy resources for the good of their deal. 2 seconds.
I yield the gentleman an additional 30 minutes, or 30 seconds.
Thank you.
The gentleman's recognized.
Energy resources for the good of their members for the good of the United States of energy security. Let's make the principle of tribal self-governance, which you talk about and never follow. Never give the Indians a break for anything. Pat them on the head. Give them a blanket and a half of beef and be quiet. That's that side over there. You do not support the American Indians. You never have, but you pat them on the head and give them a side of beef and give you back to my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, a lifelong stalwart supporter of the environment and of energy production, Mr. Dingell.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise first to pay respects to the distinguished gentleman on the majority side handling the legislation, to tell him of my affection and respect for him. But he's handling a bad bill. And I want to thank my good friend for yielding me this time. I've been to Alaska many times. I've hunted there. I've fished there. I've been in NPRA. I've been in all of the refuges and the national forests and national parks and the BLM lands up there. I've seen what a treasure it is. I've also supported actively the idea that this nation must make it possible for us to easily produce energy, but not at the price of throwing away things like our basic fundamental environmental protection laws. This legislation is not going to significantly increase production of oil. All it's going to do is be to throw away the things that are necessary to protect it against unwise use. This has been a battle that we have had in this body many, many times, where the majority will consistently seek to make it easier to drill for oil that either isn't there or isn't there in the amounts, or that is not going to be produced by the oil companies. Because we're finding that there's a lot of oil where there's authorization for drilling, where they've just got the drilling permits, and they sit there and look at the drilling permits. Oil is not produced. Well, having said this thing, the Secretary in the last year or so has increased the ability of this nation to continue producing more and more oil from the public lands. One of the problems with Alaska is the public lands are cold, they're intractable, they're harsh, and they are hard to produce oil from. So it is necessary that it takes longer for us to produce oil on those lands, and that's properly so. It's easy to produce it in the warmer, more gentle climates here in the United States. And given that fact, we can expect that we will see more rapid increases in production here than we will see up there. We have a tremendous national treasure in Alaska. produces fish, wildlife, open spaces, salmon, all kinds of riches of renewable resources of all kinds. We should not be throwing away the protections that we have put in place for those because a bunch of oil companies and oil companies.
The gentleman's recognized for an additional minute.
I thank my dear friend, and I again express my thanks. We should not throw away those protections, nor should we open those lands up to being blasted, drilled, and ditched and dug without wise protection. After all, good conservation is wise conservation and wise use of the resources. We're going to find, as time's passed, that the predictions of our Energy Department and the Department of Interior that this oil is not present in NPR, in the Arctic game range is not there in the amounts that we would like. And there's no real reason for increasing that oil production, especially by permits that will not really yield any additional production of oil to this nation. I would urge my colleagues, reject the legislation. Let the administration continue its production of oil according to wise use and see to it that we protect the treasures that we have in Alaska against unwise use.
Time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm very pleased to yield 4 minutes to the sponsor of this legislation, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I thank the chairman of the committee, Doc Hastings. I rise in strong support of H.R. 1965, the Federal Lands Job and Energy Security Act, which incorporates 4 additional bills into my bill. This legislation takes significant steps toward moving our country forward on a path to energy independence by streamlining government regulations and reducing government red tape that hinder onshore energy production. It will create new American jobs, promote energy and economic development, and increase revenues to the state and federal governments. This legislation also sets firm timelines for applications for permit to drill, or APD, approvals, and dedicates funds from APD solar and wind right-of-way fees to the permitting field offices. It will require the Bureau of Land Management to lease at least 25% of the nominated acreage not previously made available for lease. It will inject certainty into the leasing process and terms to give energy developers the certainty they need to move forward with production. It also requires the Secretary of Interior to develop a 4-year plan for onshore energy development, similar to the 5-year plan they are required to develop for offshore development. Opens up the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska for energy production, and allows the BLM to conduct leasing through the Internet. Since taking office, despite claims to the contrary, President Obama has waged a war on energy development. Under the administration, a simple permit, which in my home state of Colorado on average takes 27 days to approve, takes nearly a year on federal land. And only minuscule areas of land have been leased for energy development, despite significant interest in many more acres. In fact, the Obama administration has had the 4 lowest years of federal acres leased for energy production going back to 1988. The Obama administration has even taken the shocking and questionable step of canceling leases that have been legally bought and paid for. Energy companies are practically fleeing from developing energy on federal lands in favor of the more reliable and state and private permitting processes. Further, the Obama administration has made it harder for oil shale technology to develop, so that companies are showing little interest in developing this promising technology. While the President tries to take credit for increased energy production under his administration, the reality is that the vast majority of any increased production occurs on state and private land that the federal government has no jurisdiction over. In fact, since 2009, total federal oil production is down 7.8%, and total natural gas production on federal lands is down 21%. My legislation would interject much-needed certainty into nearly every step of the onshore energy production process. It will ensure that permits are approved in a timely fashion, would prohibit the administration from changing lease terms or revoking leases after they have been legally won, would ensure that onshore leasing moves steadily forward, and will allow the Secretary to plan for this nation's future energy needs. Energy that is available and affordable creates more jobs for Americans, rather here at home rather than overseas. It lowers the price of essential goods that American families buy every day, and it leaves more of the hard-earned money in the pockets of Americans after they pay their gas and utility bills. There is no reasonable objection to this bill. I would urge my colleagues to support this critical legislation to create new American jobs, establish an efficient process to produce both renewable and conventional energy on federal lands. We can do this while meeting the extensive environmental standards that are already in place. I urge support for this bill, and Madam Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let's summarize what is in this legislation. H.R. 1965 it's a compilation of a number of wishful bills, wishful legislation from the other side. It would shortcut environmental reviews, discourage public participation in energy development decisions, and eliminate thoughtful leasing reforms. It would require that any public entity or individual that wanted to challenge a leasing decision post a $5,000 protest fee just to be able to access the process. It would require that the Department of the Interior lease at least 25% each year of oil and gas nominated areas whether or not they are suitable for drilling now. And I do, Madam Chair, I want you to get this. It would elevate oil and gas leasing decisions above all other uses of public lands, such as hunting and fishing and grazing and conservation and recreation and other energy uses. It would also require a plan to crisscross the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska with roads and pipelines, a network that would be a bonanza for some contractor, I'm sure, ignoring the management plan that was approved this year. And why? Well, not a good reason. We don't need all these relaxations, or relaxation is too mild a word, the gutting of environmental review, the removal of public participation, because oil production is doing very well, thank you. Let's deal with the facts. Federal onshore oil production, which is what this bill is about, has increased 35%. It's actually a faster growth rate than oil production overall in the United States. And I'm not sure why the other side refuses to acknowledge that. I would think they would want to take that as good news. If you look past their talking points at the actual data, you'll see that federal onshore oil production has increased every year since 2008. And that doesn't include Indian lands, where production has also increased every year since 2008. So the fundamental premise of this bill is flawed. Now, there are right now 37 million acres of federal land under lease for oil and gas development. But 2/3 of that are not in production or exploration. So go figure. Let's go ask these companies, why are they bidding on these lands? You know, when you lease land, it's because you think it will be productive. And yet they are sitting on them. So we don't need to streamline. We don't need to remove any environmental controls in order to stimulate leasing, because 37 million acres of federal land are under lease now. And furthermore, even if the other side was right about their flawed premise, even if it was a problem in production, onshore federal oil is only 5 or 6% of total production. That's all it will be. And so this, if there were a production problem, if it were not the case that we were producing more than we have produced, we're in better shape than we've been for decades, further drilling on federal land would not be the answer. So there's no reason for this bill. It sets back the use of these federal lands to a free-for-all, unprotected state, and this is bad legislation. I reserve the rest of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, a member of the committee, Mr. Tipton.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding me time on this critical matter. I appreciate that my Planning for American Energy Act was incorporated as Title II of the Federal Land, Jobs, and Energy Security Act of 2013. This final common sense package seeks to put in place responsible American energy plans that will reduce energy costs for consumers while also spurring economic growth and job opportunities. The legislation before us today would unleash the potential for thousands of new jobs and establish a reliable, affordable, and secure source of American energy through responsible production. Title II of this Act seeks to establish common sense steps to create an all-of-the-above American energy plan for using federal lands to meet America's energy needs. Under Title II of this legislation, the Nonpartisan Energy Information Administration provides the projected energy needs of the United States for the next 30 years to the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture. The Secretaries would use this information to establish an environmentally responsible 4-year energy production plan. The bill allows for energy development on public lands in order to promote the energy and national security of the United States, in accordance with the multiple use management standards established by the Federal Land Management Policy Act. Title II requires an all-of-the-above approach to energy development responsibly in this country. The bill specifically cites wind, solar, hydropower, geothermal, oil, gas, coal, oil shale, and minerals needed for energy development to be included in the plan. These goals would be accomplished responsibly without repealing a single environmental regulation or review process. Earlier this year, an important study entitled Energy Cost Impacts on American Families was released. This study, which relies on government data, had some troubling findings, including more than 50% of U.S. households are expected to spend at least 20% of their family budgets on energy costs in 2013. This figure has nearly doubled in the last 10 years alone. Even more troubling is the fact that these energy increases have disproportionately impacted families on lower incomes and seniors on fixed incomes. This stands to reason, given the decline in energy production on federal lands under this administration. Since President Obama took office, production on federal lands has declined significantly, including a staggering 21% decline in federal natural gas production. Colorado, along with our neighboring western states, is in a unique position to contribute to our nation's energy security and ensure that the United States remains competitive in the world market by promoting a common-sense regulatory framework, embracing domestic energy research and development, and applying environmentally and safety standards already on the books rather than adding costly new mandates. We can help meet America's energy needs right here at home. providing energy and economic security that will benefit American families. And all of the above approach in energy, this responsibly increases production on our lands and is needed to ensure that the prosperity of our nation is ensured. This is exactly what H.R. 1965 will accomplish. It creates a framework to responsibly meet America's energy needs, lower energy costs for consumers, and create much-needed American jobs. I urge its immediate passage of this bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and I yield back.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Chair, I'm pleased to yield 4 minutes to the distinguished whip of the Democratic Party, Steny Hoyer from Maryland, someone who understands the importance, the economic importance of protecting the environment.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from New Jersey for yielding. Madam Speaker, this bill and the other 2 House bills we will consider this week were put forward, in my opinion, to fill time. Yes, there are unifying issues on the Republican side of the aisle, Madam Speaker, but they're not pressing. Even if they were good policy, they're not pressing. We stand here without a budget. We stand here with 10 days left to go. Madam Speaker, it's now 2:45, and it was about 2:30. And our business is through for today. No budget, no unemployment insurance extension, no farm bill, no conference report even on the budget, no immigration bill, no ending discrimination, ENDA bill, a raft of critically important issues that this House ought to be considering. And so this is somewhat the fiddle on which we are playing while Rome is burning. We shut down the government for 16 days. For the first time in 17 years, a conscious decision to shut down government. And 147 of my Republican colleagues, Madam Speaker, voted to keep the government shut down and voted against paying our bills. And yet we consider this legislation. Now, I'm against this legislation substantively. But even more egregious is the wasting of 4 of the 12 days we had available to address the issues I've just discussed. America is rightfully disgusted with the Congress of the United States. Me too. Energy security remains an important issue. I agree with my colleagues on that. But these bills offer partisan solutions to energy production that are taking our time away from pressing matters, as I've explained, like the budget conference, unemployment insurance, comprehensive immigration reform, the farm bill, Medicare physician payment formula, and tax extenders. We're all going to be wringing our hands just a few days from now, saying, of course we want to make sure there's a doc fix so that people with Medicare can make sure their doctors are paid appropriately so they'll continue to serve them. We'll say, of course we want to do that. Well, why'd you waste a week? We won't have an answer to that. Unless the answer is, well, we're really not going to address them. We'd rather address these issues that bring our party together and make us look like we're doing the work that our base wants us to do. Tomorrow's legislation seeks to block a proposed Bureau of Land Management regulation that's not even yet in effect and overreaches to cover all Interior Department lands. The first of these bills sets an arbitrary deadline on leases, permits, and reviews that stand in the way of regulators doing their job to protect citizens and affected communities. I think citizens want to be protected. Yes, they want it done in an efficient, effective manner, but they want to be protected. These bills were put forward in the name of achieving energy security when, in truth, ironically, America is now more energy secure than it has been in decades. I have 2 additional minutes.
I'd be happy to yield 2 minutes to
the gentleman is recognized for 2
gentleman.
additional minutes.
More energy independent than we've been in decades. As a matter of fact, when I talk about the Make It in America agenda of making manufacturing jobs and making things here in this country, one of our assets is we are the abundant energy supply. In the world today, there are more oil rigs in America today than the rest of the world combined. And yet, we're talking about energy security. We have it. Do we need to enhance it? Of course. Just days ago, the Energy Information Administration announced that we produced more crude oil last month, Madam Speaker, than we imported for the first time in almost 20 years. Under President Obama, oil production is up, and we now have more rigs operating, as I said, than the rest of the world combined. Domestic natural gas extraction has also grown to an all-time record, and energy companies already hold more than 20 million acres of public land onshore on which they have yet to produce oil or gas. That is 56% of leased public lands onshore. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, was speaking of that. These bills distract and delay this body's critical attention to the issues of critical concern to all America, and yes, indeed, to the rest of the world that wants to see and needs a responsible, fiscally secure America. No budget conference, no farm bill, no immigration bill, no ENDA bill, all which passed the Senate in a bipartisan fashion. They're worthy of debate. That doesn't mean either side has to agree, but that's what we ought to be debating, ladies and gentlemen of this House, because they're the critical issues that are confronting us before the end of this year. And yet we waste our time, and frankly, we let ourselves off early because we don't have enough work to do. I urge opposition to these 3 bills. I urge the majority party to bring the important pieces of legislation to the floor that America needs, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chairman, before I yield to my colleague from Ohio, I need to yield myself 1 minute to
Gentleman
respond.
is recognized for 1 minute.
To respond to my good friend, the Minority Leader. He characterized these bills as being not pressing. Mr. Chairman, I would point out that probably the biggest issue facing America that we have heard from our constituents, probably on both sides of the aisle, is the need to have a growing economy and jobs. American energy, we have a chance to capture American energy and jobs with this legislation. So while it's not pressing, as the gentleman says, it is certainly very, very important. And I'd also point out, the gentleman was, Minority Leader was talking about several issues that are important. I would just suggest that probably number 1 on Americans' minds right now actually started on October 1st when a sign-up for the health care plan passed. Now, if there is something that is absolutely pressing that needs to pass this Congress before the end of the year, it's to rectify how people can keep the policies, that health care policies, that they wanted. And I might add, last Friday, I yield myself another 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Last Friday, in a bipartisan vote, 39 members of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle joined us to ensure that if people like their health care policies, they can keep their health care policies. Now, that bill is waiting in the Senate. We have a bicameral legislature. We know they have to act. But if there is one thing that is absolutely pressing before we get done, is to resolve that issue. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise in support of the Federal Lands, Jobs, and Energy Security Act. This important legislation will help streamline onshore energy production and create jobs right here in America. I want to thank the Chairman for including legislation I've introduced, the BLM Live Internet Auctions Act, as a title in this legislation. As we're all aware, oftentimes the federal government is behind the private sector when it comes to technological innovation. As a former Chief Information Officer of a publicly traded company, I understand how much more efficient the federal government could become if we were able to provide some much-needed technological innovation. The BLM Live Internet Auctions Act will allow the federal government to come into the 21st century and do what the private sector has already been doing for over a decade. This legislation fixes an unintended consequence of a 26-year-old law that requires that BLM conduct auctions by oral bidding. Back in 1987, the Internet hadn't even been created by a certain former vice president, and this bill simply gives the Bureau of Land Management the option to conduct auctions for their lease sales over the Internet. Traditional in-person auctions will still be held, but we can more effectively speed up the sales, reduce fraud, and ensure the best return to federal taxpayers. For oil and gas leases, by conducting them securely online. Most importantly, this legislation will ensure efficient and timely lease sales so that developers can more quickly begin producing homegrown energy for American consumers and create much-needed jobs for Americans. We know that BLM has the capability to do this because back in 2009, BLM conducted a test run of the program, selling 28 parcels via live Internet auctions. By all accounts, they were very successful. The pilot program resulted in 1,500 unique visitors from 46 states, increasing the number of bidders and the sale price when compared with traditional in-person auctions. Even the administration supports this legislation, and I'm hopeful that the Senate will act on it quickly so that we can bring the BLM process into the 21st century. I urge all of my colleagues to support the underlying legislation, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, the minority member of highest rank on our committee, the Resources Committee. May I ask how much time the gentleman
from New Jersey has 11.5 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Washington has 9.5 minutes remaining.
And may I ask the gentleman from Oregon
I don't expect I'll use anywhere near half that, so why don't you just
I'd be happy to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. I was listening with interest to some of the statements made earlier in the debate about the administration deliberately restraining the oil and gas industry in this country. Actually, the facts belie those statements. The federal lands oil production is growing faster than that on private lands, plus 30, plus 35. Obviously, they start with a larger base, but still, it is growing faster. So that hardly shows any deliberate attempt by the Obama administration to limit this production. And then, you know, again, they talked about, you know, that this president had not leased an adequate amount of land. But if you look, these little photos are the former President George Bush, and when the lines start to go up, these are the current President, Barack Obama. And onshore oil production on federal lands is up 35%. So let's deal with what the real intent here is. The Obama administration has an all-of-the-above strategy. They're trying to produce these resources responsibly. The other side of the aisle would have us believe that environmental laws and other restrictions and an intentional campaign by the Obama administration is making us vulnerable to foreign influence, whereas actually our imports were at the lowest level in recent history in the last year. We're producing more and more of our own oil and headed toward self-sufficiency. But we also have to deal with climate change, and we also have to deal with prices to consumers. Now, this legislation, we're actually celebrating Thanksgiving a week early. I would call it a bill of turkey, but it's not just a turkey. It's leftovers from Turkey Day because we've actually passed this legislation previously, And it went nowhere previously, as will this legislation here today. But they want to pretend that this somehow will benefit consumers and somehow that there's a campaign by the Obama administration to restrain the supply. Nothing be further from the truth. I'll have an amendment later. If we wanted to drive down prices at the pump tomorrow by 70 cents, pretty simple. Just stop the speculation on Wall Street. But I'll talk about that more later. There are a number of provisions that are egregious. Don't have time to go into all of them. But, a few things, as I mentioned earlier, basically do away with environmental protections, muzzle the public's voice in terms of them appealing decisions by the distant federal government to develop in their backyard or next door, to elevate oil and gas drilling to the predominant use on any federal public lands. Yes, predominant use, over and above hunting, fishing, recreation. Anything else, oil and gas, is predominant. Now, the President also said, I think that we ought to go out and look at these parcels before we lease them. That's something they didn't do in the Bush era. We have, 25-year-old land use plans at many of these agencies. They're understaffed. They're behind. They haven't revised their land use plans in a long time. A lot of things have happened in the West in 25 years, and it might be that there is now a ski resort right next to a proposed an area that was previously available or potentially available for oil and gas leasing. Obama administration said we ought to go out and look and see how it's going to impact other activities that have, come to the fore in the last 25 years. They're being criticized for that. Now, that does take, a little bit of time, but they're saying, hey, some states are leasing private lands, allowing them to go, they're allowing private lands to go forward in 10 days. These aren't private lands. These are the lands of the people of the United States of America. I think a little more due diligence is in order. We don't want to mimic a state that says, oh, you want to drill there? Okay, here you go. No one gets to say anything about it. It's your land. You go right ahead. Now, then there's one, it's amazing. This is kind of a fun math issue. They say that the industry can nominate land, which is the current law, but they're saying the government must lease 25% of whatever the industry chooses to nominate in a given year. So there are 130 million acres available for oil and gas leasing in the United States, predominantly in the West. So first year, the industry nominates 130 million acres. That means the Interior Department has to offer 32 million acres to lease. Now, next year, well, we've only got 100 million left, so they'd get 25% of that. That's 25 million acres. As you can figure it out, we're sort of infinitely headed towards zero here. Rush, as a scientist, he can probably figure it out better. I don't know if we'd ever get to zero, but it would be an ever and ever smaller increment that we were leasing here. And yet there are 25 million acres that the industry has under lease that they haven't yet developed. But they could get this astonishing, increase. Just one additional minute.
I yield an additional minute to the gentleman.
Recognized for one additional minute.
Work on my math problem during the minute, see if you can get the answer. So, this, I was thinking of bringing a map of all the leasable land, but it would have been, difficult to produce. But you can get it in your imagination. So let's deal with